early days of the male part of the club, we have to remember that back in those days, men were allowed to play on weekends and work all week, and mothers tolerated that sort of behavior, and the guys did not engage as much in child rearing as they do today, much to our regret now that we have grown up. We find that that was a mistake, many of us, that we left a good deal of our life on the table by not engaging more with our children on weekends. But those are regrets I have personally, and I'm sure that the many guys my age have similar regrets. But life at the country club was a Saturday sort of a deal. Many of us could not get out to play during the weeks because we were working. Doctor's Day was Wednesday. They were given half days off, so they had some of our old rules of how the course will be governed are still in place because of living patterns that existed 40 years ago. There's a great need to modernize those and to probably recognize that golf on the golf course should be open at all times to all members. Maybe you can still have the women's group on Tuesdays, but after that there's really no men's time anymore. Men hardly are playing on Saturday mornings, and so it's a very different setting that we have today. Families are equalized in terms of responsibilities. Wives are now making, according to recent surveys, 85% of the decisions on what clubs to join and what clubs where and what they will do when they get there. So if you can't appeal to the wife of the household, you're not going to have a member there. And if you can't take good care of their children while they're there, you won't have them there either, if you're going to be a country club. Which gets us to the golf part of Lakewood, which has always been a great tradition there. We've raised good golfers, many of them children of members, some of them late to the party. It's interesting that the best members seem to be, or at least the most loyal, seem to be those who are first and second generation who have been there a long time. The better golfers seem to come and go. There are those who with families seem to stay around, and we're happy for those. Bobby Smith comes to mind as a very loyal and long-term member, and we have recent champions as well who are, we have a cook who is a second generation, who now drives number 2 hole from the blue tees, puts it in the left trap off the green, and we wonder why we now have to move tees way back. So life has changed on the golf course. Primarily, you think about some of the, excuse me while I wipe my eyes. We think about the causes for the golf game as we know it today, and I belong to a couple of other organizations. A guy by the name of Tatum, who is famous on the West Coast, Sandy Tatum, said that the whole game has been destroyed by the development of the modern golf ball. And he said, if you really want to restore the values of golf, what you really need to do is control the ball. If you consider tennis, for instance, if everybody brought their own tennis balls to serve, what could we do? What might happen to that game? So control is through the golf ball, but it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and I'm sure Titleist and all the other competitors don't want to be making a homogenized golf ball that all of us could maybe be controlled through. So the golf ball is the issue in golf in terms of distance and other things. But the culture of Lakewood Country Club grew up around this kind of old World War II hangover, if you will. When I joined, the men were still kings, and they partied late into the night, and there were stag nights that were centered around activities that were primarily gambling and drinking oriented, and those things are, I think, a thing of the past. there are a number of wives today who would not tolerate some of the things that went on in those days, and including my own, which we've discussed at a time or two. So, but there's a lot of mistake about all that old culture. It really wasn't as free as you might think it was. It was kind of adolescent in its behavior, and not as much fun as everybody might think. And alcoholism was a problem that began to emerge during these years, and for me particularly. And at age 30, whatever I was, 32 or 33, maybe a little 35, after maybe only 2 years at Lakewood, I recognized I had a problem, and quit drinking and became a teetotaler for the rest of my life. And it put me on the outside socially of a lot of things, but by the same token, it put me inside with my family again, and I was happy about that. I make this confession publicly because it's a big part of my life still to be a non-drinking human being. Not that it occupies any thinking, but I've learned a lot about life through the principles of the 12 steps and how it applies in all areas, including mental health and other things. And I work very hard on all these issues still today. In my later life here at Lakewood, I've seen changes that in the culture of the club which are no longer appealing to me. And you'll find that I will probably have to depart the club here. In fact, I will be departing the club in the next month. The things that are most disturbing to me are the cultural, the changes to governance that have occurred in the past 5 years particularly. When I was in the early 70s, I was assigned to a committee I was on the board as secretary, and I chaired a committee to rewrite the bylaws and to modernize them. And that revision stood in place and very carefully for the next some years until the revision that Ptacek created and got through to do the final modernization, which I think was to take females, to make females equal members in the club if they should join. So that was the last step of modernization. And there were some other minor changes to the bylaws at that time, which are legally, I think, important, although I'm not expert in that area to tell you. But the bylaws and the Code of Regulations, which are two separate documents, the code covers how the club will govern itself, and the bylaws relate to special rules that the board itself can alter by its own majority vote. The Code of Regulations requires a membership vote, and any change of it requires major activity and major action to get it published and reviewed. We went through that process during my review, and during our review, and others who served on that committee included Dave Benson, Art Steinmetz, and a cast of lawyers that was an interesting committee to run. I can tell you that there were 12 of them there, and there wasn't a meeting that was conducted that we had any consensus about anything. It was a scene. So finally, when the final draft was put together and reviewed, and I majored in English when I was in college, English literatures. I was a fairly decent writer, and at least grammar was correct, and I knew that the logic was good, and we put it all together, we put it to a vote and got it approved. But that Code of Regulations and bylaws served as the guide for every board that I was privy to until the last 5 years. as a result of that, committee structure was very well set. Committee chairmen were very well selected based on prior service. The board members were very well selected based on succession and prior service in committees, so that there's a good foundation for understanding of how the club operated and how its traditions were. That was built into the committee structure, and that lasted and existed until this recent past. In the recent past, the change has been that the board is making all decisions. And instead of governing, they're actually operating the club on a day-to-day basis and making many decisions. That's gone so far as to really remove the general management structure, which we had fought hard to put in place, and convinced everyone that the board should be a policy-setting group, not a management organization. And that professionals should run the club to keep the amateurs out of the problem. And as we all know, this has not occurred, and we now have a very active board making all kinds of decisions that affect the lives and future of the club. It will remain to be seen whether these are good decisions or bad decisions. We know that the club will be incurring a great deal of debt, and whether it can survive the debt load in this time of an imminent peril on the economic horizon is uncertain at this time as I speak to you. And I'm very much concerned about that. However, hyperinflation might be to the advantage of the club members, and this might be the best time in the world to borrow money. And we may find that we can pay back this $9 million debt that we're incurring with some simple maneuvering in the future when the dollar's worth maybe pennies on what it's worth today. So maybe our guys are prescient, maybe they've got it, maybe they do, and I wish them all well. And I wish you all well too. And thanks for letting me talk to you.
Dave, I'd like to ask you one question.
Yes.
Would you tell us about your children?
Oh, sure.
We went ahead and we know about you and Connie and how you met.
Yeah.
Blind date, so which is great. That's very interesting. But tell us about your children.
I have, Connie and I have three very fine children. They're all now in their 40s. They all, each child has 3 children each. And we have 9 grandchildren who we don't get to see as much as we should, because 3 of them live in Chicago and 3 live in Seattle. But our children are Dan, Amy, and Emily, born in that order. And Dan is the oldest. He's a management consultant with Accenture Corporation. He's doing very well there. Very proud of him. Very bright guy. Graduated in engineering from Michigan State University and went on to Berkeley, that far liberal school in San Francisco, in Oakland actually, or Berkeley, California, where he got his master's in engineering in a specialized field of wave action. He graduated, decided after interviewing at Exxon and a few other people that he could never wear brown shoes and put a clip holder in his pocket. Dan's about a 3-4 handicap. He was raised on the country club course. Not that he's a country club guy, but he knows some things about life, and he said, I need more freedom in that. And he followed, not my example, but a friend of his into the consulting business, where he has prospered and had a career that still goes on, and I expect that, hopefully, that there's another step for him, which will be maybe not to the top job, but certainly into that room with the top job. Great. And he's very close to that. Amy, and Dan's name is Lauderback. Amy Lauderback Lee is the widow of Kenneth Lee, who was a member at Lakewood. Ken died almost 2 years ago, in 2 years, January of next year, of pancreatic cancer, and she's surviving with her 3 children. They live in Westlake. Amy's a PhD child psychologist employed by the Cleveland Clinic, runs a very good practice, pediatric practice for children who need help. She's highly regarded. She's an eager beaver, energetic, great lady, whom we are very proud. Excuse me. I can't think of Amy without thinking of Ken. And then there's Emily, our youngest, who's always been perhaps the most bright and creative of the three, who lives in Seattle, and she's divorced and has a business. She's now working in the internet field and